period for the road movie, because that's when, number one, a lot of interesting road movies were produced through other classical genres, but also a lot of road movies in the 60s and 70s will be set in the Depression, because that's a time when people, home came under under siege, under a kind of catastrophe, or there was this social crisis about everything related to domesticity, to home, to work, and so people were forced to be moving around, and it was more dystopic rather than utopian. The Kerouac novel is a visionary, kind of uplifting, sublimating version of road travel, but there's another kind of road travel that is more ominous, more cynical, more driven by social circumstance. So in the novel The Grapes of Wrath, we follow this family on this trek that they're forced into, and this journey across country out to California is just
horrific.
It's horrific. It's a real trial, and it's a real critique of America. And that's that goes back to my thesis, to use an academic or a term that we don't like to use. But my whole kind of the essence of my argument, or what I'm trying to suggest about the road movie is it's that most of the time it really involves a critique of America. It's saying something subversive in some way, trying to go against conventional knowledge, conventional thought, conventional conventional behavior, conventional attitudes, about the home and the family and work. These sort of conservative, Protestant-derived ethics that are great in many ways, but I mean the road movie is interested in something else. It's interested in getting away from that and making some kind of a social commentary on that. And so both The Grapes of Wrath and On the Road, in very different ways, use mobility to get outside of American society and look at it from a critical distance, and appraise it, and often reject it.
Okay.
So,
as literary conventions tend to overlap literary genres, so does film in some instances. For example, you argue that the road movie is linked to a larger and once very popular genre, the Western. How are the two connected?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think they are connected, and one wouldn't think so, because the Western that seems in many ways removed in terms of its mood and its tone and its values and the whole setting. But in fact, in terms of certain essential themes working in the Western, that really gets carried over into the road movie. I mean, first of all, this idea of the male individual, the kind of rugged male individual, populates road movies more than most other kinds of characters, even though it's a modernized version. And this harks back to the tradition of the Westerner who doesn't say much, and who does a lot, and who moves around a lot, and who kind of wanders. I mean, the Western is usually set in a time when America as a domesticated space was not complete. There was still this divide between, the wilderness or the Wild West and home or the East, or this whole idea about the homesteading narrative.
Manifest destiny.
The whole idea of manifest destiny is still being played out in the Western and explored, and so many great Westerns, a lot of those by John Ford, but by other directors, Howard Hawks. I mean, there's Red River, there's Stagecoach by John Ford, there's the Searchers. I mean, the title itself kind of, a lot of the masterpieces, the title itself of The Searchers kind of invokes what the road movie is
Exactly.
about, you know, the searchers. It's
Yeah.
about the search for self and for
Truth.
country and
Yeah.
for truth. And so, you know, the Western is often about some kind of journey into the wilderness and a kind of, you know, exploration of territory
Okay.
and an exploration of what the wilderness means and the tension between nature and culture.
And that
you know.
certainly comes out in Easy Rider, which we'll talk about.
Yes, and I mean, that's the thing. It really comes out in a lot of road movies. It's about trying to rediscover something that is outside of culture.
Right.
And that's what the Western is all about, that tension between what's not yet part of culture and what is safely cultural.
Exactly. The city and the outskirts of the city.
Yes.
And what lies beyond that.
Exactly.
You mentioned in the book that relatively no road movies of significant note were produced in the 50s, but somehow the 50s rock and roll film
Uh-huh.
and the road movie are somewhat linked together,
Yes.
kind of based on the disenchantment theme of American youth. Could you
Mhm.
maybe expand a little bit about that?
Sure, sure. I mean, I think that, you know, there are a couple of interesting road movies that come out in the 50s, but they tend to be, you know, sort of more conservative, more homebound, more comic. You know, a lot of people ask me about the Hope Crosby
Right.
Road to
On the Road
series.
to, yeah.
And, you know, one of the things I say is that, number one, they're not really road movies in the sense that I think of the larger tradition of road movies, because they're so innocuous and conservative and sort of homey and cheery, but they
Okay.
also don't really go
In
anywhere.
any particular direction.
No, I mean, it's about getting to a certain place, and then usually most of the film happens there, and the whole idea of the road in those films is just a superficial pretext for
Okay.
the comic interaction of the characters and this comic interaction with the place that they've gone to, whether it's Morocco or Bali. You know, usually these very exotic locations that you can't actually get to on a road.
So it's
you
kind
know?
of, it's mostly played for laughs.
It's mostly played for laughs.
Superficial.
Yeah, there's an interesting film by Vincente Minnelli called The Long, Long Trailer with Lucille Ball, and it's about this family that is, you know, on the road on a vacation in their trailer.
Sure.
And it's cute, you know, but it's it's interesting as a cute road movie. But there aren't really that many. So kind of to get back to your question, I mean, there's what I see happening in the 50s is the emergence of the tourist industry, the whole development of a kind of acceleration of consumer society in terms of road travel, the whole idea of
The highway system,
the highway
under
system,
Eisenhower,
exactly.
you
The
mentioned
whole
that.
yes, I talk a lot about the whole program that Eisenhower pushed through successfully to really invest in the development of the whole interstate highway system, that in a way lays the literal groundwork for the road movie, because before then roads weren't that great and it was more difficult to get around, and I think that that's connected somewhat to the fact that you couldn't really have a road movie. You had classical Hollywood screwball comedies or gangster films or film noir that took place on the road, but the roads kind of stunk. And so, you know, the roads get really good during Eisenhower, and then in the 60s you get road movies because the roads are so good, and you can really have this fluid, sleek sense of narrative and of traveling, a kind of traveling narrative. But as you brought up as well, this whole idea of the 1950s as a time period when, you know, you've got Happy Days, you've got Suburbia, you've got the Eisenhower era, the Eisenhower image of America, but then you've got Jack Kerouac, you've got the Beatniks, you've got the Bohemian lifestyle, and the Elvis Presley, you know, emergence of rock and roll, and this kind of restless youth culture. Well, the restless youth culture of the 50s grows up out of their teens into their 20s, and it's the mid-60s, and it's a civil rights protests and the Vietnam War protests, and they get on motorcycles and they go riding around the country because they're sick of everything.
And in a linear fashion, it really lays the groundwork for all the road movies that follow.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think it does. I
Yeah.
think that's kind of what happens generally.